Shalom, shalom, welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. Welcome. These are our midweek online Torah study, which we do with you from our home. Welcome to our home. This is a Torah discussion, Torah study that we do on each week's Torah portion. The Torah is broken up into weekly readings, and we go through that and have a little discussion time. So welcome, and I'm glad to be here with you. A couple of announcements, as we always do. We have online teaching on our YouTube channel, including the Torah studies, also the Revelation series. I encourage you to listen into that. Also, our services, our Shabbat services, are online now. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. We also have live services on Shabbat. You're welcome to join us if you're here in Fort Myers. And I'd like to thank you for all of you who continue to support this ministry. I'm very grateful and just feel privileged to be partnering with all of you in the work of the kingdom of Adonai, in the work of the gospel of Yeshua here during these days. If you'd like to continue to support us or like to start supporting us, of course, you can find the link below in the video description. So let's begin. Tomorrow night is Rosh Chodesh, and in observing the head of the moon, the new moon, also the beginning of the month of Elul, leading up to the High Holy Days. And so the month of Elul is always a very emotional and powerful time in our lives as we draw near to Adonai, as we find ourselves coming into that trajectory of the High Holy Days, of Rosh Hashanah, of the Yom Teruah, the Day of the Blast, the Yom Kippur, and then of course the Sukkot and the celebrations around all those. So we will be announcing what our schedule is for those. But suffice it to say, for now, we are beginning our view of the High Holy Days for this year. And of course, everything is informed by the current crisis that surrounds the world, and that is the COVID crisis. And so we'll have to take that into account as we plan our services and plan what we're going to do. But, you know, some things don't change and some things cannot change. And so we are grateful that the holidays are as relevant as ever, and we are looking forward to what Adonai is going to show us this year for the holidays, for these special times. Okay, this week's Parsha is Shoftim, which means judges. And it is Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 16, 18, chapter 16, verse 18 through chapter 21, verse 9. That is this week's Parsha. You know that we're getting close when we're midway through Devarim already, and we are winding down very, very quickly. The Parsha begins with a discussion of judges, that judges are to be appointed in all the walled cities. Every town effectively would have a tribunal to judge when necessary. Next, the Parsha discusses prohibitions on forms of idolatry and forms of idol worship. If one was found to be convicted of idolatry, and it says with 2 or 3 witnesses, that the hand of the witnesses would be the first to put him to death, meaning that there would be a wrongful accusation, and the judgment, the sentence that would be handed down by the hands of those who had perhaps wrongfully accused, making them directly guilty of murder. In this way, perhaps, would discourage false accusations and so forth. If the case is too difficult for these tribunals to judge, then the case is sent up to a higher court. In Devarim, chapter 16, it says this: "Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may live and inherit the land." Justice is supposed to be part of their society. It's supposed to be part of the temperament of their society. We continue on next with the discussion on the appointment of a king. that the people would desire a king to be like other nations, to lead them in battle, to provide for security, to provide someone for them to rally around. And so some of these requirements are made and discussed here for what you would have for a king. Next we have Moses' prophecy of the Mashiach, that a prophet for you like me would come from you, from your brothers. Devarim chapter 18 verse 15. Today the non-believing Jews are waiting for this prophet. When Yochanan was immersing at the Jordan, the scribes came out and asked him, "Are you the Elijah?" Remember, Elijah was the one who did not die, but he was taken up in the whirlwind. They asked Yochanan, "Are you the Elijah?" And then they asked him, "Are you the prophet?" And they were referring to this prophecy that Moses had here in Devarim, a prophet for you, like me, from among the brothers. Let me just pull that up here. Adonai your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among the midst from your brothers. To him you must listen. This is just what you asked of Adonai your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, when saying, "I cannot continue to hear the voice of Adonai my God, or see this great fire any more, or I will die." Meaning the king was to be an intermediary between Adonai and the people. The king, or I'm sorry, not the king, but the prophet was to be an intermediary between Adonai and the people. And Moses is laying out this prophecy when he speaks of this. Today, many non-believing Jews are still waiting for the appearance of this prophet. Some commentators have analyzed the life of Moses and Yeshua and have created lists of comparisons and between the two. They were both born during times of great violence and persecution. Both were in Egypt as infants. Both were teachers of the law, so on and so on and so forth. So this is Moses is naming this prophet who's going to identifying this prophet who's going to come from among them in the future. Next, we have a discussion of the responsibilities of the people toward the priests and the cities of refuge for the manslayer, the city that the manslayer can run to in the event of an accidental death, but it's the right kind of accidental death, that there was no hatred for the person, the manslayer, that he would be allowed to go and take refuge in one of these cities. And then this very curious passage that speaks about what to do when a body is found in a field, and what you would do is you would go and the city nearest to where this body is found would be the city that takes up the cause and is the goes through a ritual of sorts. Let me go ahead and pull that up for you here. We'll just read that from the text. It'd be a good way to do that. Suppose a slain person is found fallen in a field. On the land Adonai your God is giving you to possess. Who struck him is unknown. Then your elders and judges must come out and measure the distance to the towns that are around the slain one. Now the town nearest to the slain one, the elders of that city are to take from the herd a heifer that has not been used for work or pulled a yoke. The elders of that city are to bring the heifer down to a flowing wadi that has not been plowed or sown. They sacrifice this heifer, and then the Kohanim, the sons of Levi, come forward, and they are to take the elders of that city will wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken, and then they answer and say, "Our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see. Grant atonement for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, Adonai, and do not put innocent blood on your people Israel. Then atonement will be granted to them for the blood. So you will purge the guilt of innocent blood from your midst when you do what is right in Adonai's sight." And one of the reasons for the obvious reasons, I find this a fascinating interlude here. There are times that the Torah gives us very specific instructions, and we think, well, boy, this is kind of an obscure thing. Sometimes the Torah gives us instructions that are generalizations to help us with different things. But this is one of those cases where it's giving us a very specific instruction. Sometimes these very specific instructions are as much to teach us about the nature and character of Adonai than anything else. The truth of the matter is the eyes of the Lord go to and fro throughout the earth, and that He sees what happens. He is the God who sees, and He will see the victim, the anonymous victim. A person is found fallen in the field. The one who struck him is unknown. Perhaps even the victim is unknown. Nobody knows how this happened or what happened. And so, in terms of justice, how do you bring about justice for this victim? And just showing how important justice is to Adonai, that He would have the nearest city take responsibility for this slain person and offer up sacrifices to atone for this victim, for his blood. And it says here, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see. Grant atonement for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, Adonai, and do not put innocent blood on your people Israel. In other words, our hands are innocent, and you can't put this blood on our hands. We didn't do this. But at the same time, they are expressing a measure of responsibility here and going through this. And it just strikes me that Adonai gives us the opportunity to take responsibility for our neighbors and for the victims in our lives, and to be advocates for them, even to the degree of the processing of atonement, to be advocates for the atonement of these sins that do happen around us. So just a fascinating interlude. More discussion there sometime if we get some time. All right, moving on again to our study. Would like to dig in a little bit more. The first point that I want to make this week is the point of the discussion about a king. So the question is this an imperative discussion? Is this an imperative commandment? Is this a positive commandment? You shall do this. Now let's read the text from Devarim in chapter 17. And I'll just pull that up here. Verse 14 of chapter 17 of Deuteronomy. When you come to the land that Adonai your God has given you, possess it and dwell in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like the nations around me. You will indeed set over yourselves a king, whom Adonai your God chooses. One from among your brothers will be appointed as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not like your brother, only he should not multiply horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to multiply horses, because Adonai has said to you, you must never go back that way again, nor should he multiply wives for himself, so that his heart does not turn aside, nor multiply much silver and gold for himself. Okay, so what is happening here? When you come to the land that Adonai your God has given you, and you possess in it, and you dwell in it for a little while, you're comfortable there, and you say, I will set a king over me. We need a king. We must have a king. We're not comfortable not having a king. Then it says, then you shall appoint your king, and it'll be the man whom Adonai your God chooses. The appointment of a king, we have a narrative of this in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And it says this, Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, Behold, you have grown old. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But we have this in the Samuel narrative. This matter was displeasing in Samuel's eyes. So Samuel goes to Adonai. Verse 7, Adonai says to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people. They have not rejected you. Rather, they have rejected me from being a king over them. So they are doing to you. Now listen to their voice. However, you must earnestly warn them and declare to them the rulings of the king who will rule over them. This earnest warning, what is this earnest warning? Well, it goes back to this Torah portion that we're reading today. He should not multiply horses. He should not multiply silver and gold for himself. He shouldn't multiply wives, etc. Remember the angel of Exodus chapter 23, Shemot chapter 23. We talked about this in my message on Shabbat. The Adonai is speaking here, and he speaks of wanting to be a king over them. And then we have this passage in Shemot 23. Behold, I am sending an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you into the place that I have prepared. Watch for him and listen to his voice. Do not rebel against him, because he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you will closely listen to his voice and do everything I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. My angel will go before you and bring you to the Amorites, the Hittites, etc., and I will cut them off. Moreover, I will take the sickness away from your midst. You are to serve Adonai your God, and he will bless your food and your water. So all the things that Israel would ask for from a king is being offered to them. In the first place, is being offered to them in the form of Adonai, who wanted to be a king over Israel. And it's in the second place being offered here in Shemot in Exodus in the form of this angel. We also have this passage from the beginning of Joshua, where we see Joshua preparing to go into the land. And when he does this, he lifts up his eyes and he sees let's see, let me pull it up here. This is after the circumcision. And it says, came to pass, it says, when Joshua was preparing to enter the land, preparing to conquer Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a man standing in front of him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua approached him and said, Are you for us or for our adversaries? Neither, he said, rather I've come as a commander of Adonai's army. Joshua fell on his face on the ground and worshipped. Then he asked him, What is my Lord saying to his servant? Notice that when John in the Revelation fell down in worship, he was lifted up, and here we have this likewise. But Joshua is not lifted up. In effect, the man is accepting Joshua's worship, which is notable in a prophetic sense. We think that this appearance is an appearance of Yeshua here. Because of the response of Joshua falling on his face and worshiping. What is my Lord saying to his servant? And the commander of Adonai's army replied, Take your sandal off your foot, for the place you are standing on is holy. Joshua did so. What is the other time that we had the ground being holy and the person having to take their sandal off? It was Moses at the burning bush at Horeb. Okay, so what am I connecting here? What I'm connecting here is this dynamic where Israel was preparing to go into the land, and Adonai was cautioning them through Moses that you're going to someday want a king for yourself, that I was going to be your king, but that isn't going to work out because you're going to be dissatisfied with that. The model that Adonai had set up was for him to act as a king over them. And the appearance of this angel or this man, depending on your reading, whether it be in Exodus or in Joshua, is going to be the physical form thereof of the kingship of Adonai in the land and the conquering of the land. So Adonai was prepared to provide them with everything, but they wanted a man. A quote by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. If you listen to me, you know I quote him from time to time. I'm fond of his work. From Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, to appoint a king speaking of the Israelites here in this context, to appoint a king is not a noble wish, but a failure of imagination and nerve. What was being offered to Israel was the chance to live a different life, to be a peculiar kind of nation, to follow Adonai as king, a spiritual king, if you will. But now that seems all very great. But let me ask you: is it very practical? The Torah is a system of spiritualizing governance to the degree that it needs to be successful. In other words, the Torah is a system of taking spiritual principles of Adonai, and making it practical to the form that it could be used as a bureaucracy, as a governance, as a tool of governing. And I believe that is in part the purpose of the Torah. All governments are spiritual bodies. This is what I believe. I believe all governments are spiritual bodies. In other words, they are a spiritual force to be reckoned with. If you question this, just think of the various communist nations which were hostile to the kingdom of Adonai. Think of our government and its involvement into morality and ethics and honesty, integrity, justice. These things are compromised by evil people, and in these cases, in most of modern life, our moralities, our ethics, our justice is corrupted. Our truth is diluted to serve the demands of our depravity, of our hedonism, of our explorations of pleasure and debasement. All these things, the governance is enabling or facilitating or is somehow involved in. So now your depravity, your morality is being defended as a civil right in governance. And this is not a new phenomenon for North America, for the United States. This has been around since the beginning of time. That is to say that governments have always facilitated evil and facilitated depravity, facilitated error and injustice and so forth. The Torah is offered here as a system of governance without a king. It's offered as a system that would practically work if anyone would try it. They used to say of democracy, it works every time it's tried. Unfortunately, democracy has fallen out of failure in our modern based societies. But back to this idea of the Torah offering a governance without a king. Again, is this practical? Is it truly practical to have almost a rulership by judges and by committee and by this system of laws in the Torah? Does it really work? The vast majority of the kings of the northern and southern kingdoms in Israel and Judah were evil and corrupt and led the people into idolatry and the rejection of Torah. And this, of course, could be a great argument for opposing the idea of having a king, that having a king is a bad idea. But to this same, we also have the examples of David, of Solomon, of Josiah and Hezekiah. We have the David, who was a man after Adonai's own heart, who brought unity and established the unity of the nation of Israel. We have Solomon, who continued this growth and expansion and built the temple in Jerusalem. We have revivals under Josiah and Hezekiah. We have huge chunks of the Bible that were written by David and Solomon. Hezekiah had the doors to the temple reopened and led a revival. We have all these examples of great things that were done by these kings. So yes, you could say that the kings were corrupt and it was a corrupt institution, but you also have to acknowledge that God used these kings in incredible and profound ways. All of them had their personal failings. All of them had their failures as kings, and within the context of their rule as a king, their failures, their depravity became a bigger issue. David and his dalliance with Bathsheba, which was which led to murder of her husband. Profound evil, and for which he paid dearly, but still he was allowed to keep his throne. He was allowed to maintain his kingdom and even increase it over his lifetime. So it's not so much that that the kings are inherently bad or fundamentally bad. In contrast to this, we also see the example of Judges. In Judges, the book of Judges, we have the history after the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. We have the history of what everybody did. And some of the craziest stories in the Bible are in the book of Judges. If you were to tell your neighbor some of these stories and say, "Now that's in the Bible," they'd shake their head and say, "No, that story can't be in the Bible," because it's just too crazy. We could talk about this sometime. But the closing comment, the last line of the book of Judges is this: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so what I want to propose to you is that we have in Israel a bipolar example. We have monarchy versus anarchy. And neither one is well served by the people. Neither one is all too functional. They're both problematic. Notice that the kings of Israel were prevented from enacting laws, at least if they were obedient to Torah. The laws of Israel came from Torah by design. They were expressions of God's own character. What does it mean to have a king? What does it mean to have a figurehead, a person who calls themselves king? In a congregational sense, it means having a leader, rabbis and pastors and leaders. In a national sense, it means to have a leader, a figurehead whom everyone follows, who everyone considers the head of the nation. Every king has good and bad records at times. And notice that kings and priests were kept separate. They were made distinct. The offices were distinct all the way up to the coming of Yeshua. I believe the reason for that is because the example of the priest is one of power. The priest, of course, is responsible for the worship, and the king is responsible for the defense, if you will, of the nation. So the jury's out on whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to have a king in Israel, and we see this expressed in the way that Adonai talks about what to do when you want a king. It's almost a very real sense. When you get into the land, you say to yourself, "I will set a king over me like the nations around me." You will indeed do this, and I will be part of the process, says Adonai. I will choose the one for you. This is in a context of where the people were strongly exhorted to never ever do anything like the nations around them, that they had to be distinct, that they had to be separate. So, again, what I'm offering to you is that this idea that Adonai is not ruling out the idea of the king. Adonai is not rejecting a king. They rejected Adonai as king when they came to Samuel and said, "We want you to name a king over us." Now, what does it mean to say they rejected Adonai as king? Well, we know Yeshua is the king. He is Mashiach ben David, Messiah of the line of David. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He is the king. I call him the Melech Mechei Hamlechim, king of all kings. This is Yeshua. And in that sense, what Adonai was referring to when they came to Samuel and said, "Well, they haven't done this to you. They've rejected me as king over them." It is a prophetic acknowledgement that they were going to choose someone else rather than choose Adonai, and Adonai chose for them who was going to be their natural king, and Adonai first chose Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. And then it became after him David of the tribe of Judah. And we can talk about those connections as well. So let's look for a little bit more of these instructions for this king. Devarim chapter 17 verse 20. When he, that is the king, sets on the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself a copy of this Torah on a scroll from what is before the Levitical Kohanim. It will remain with him, and he will read it in all the days of his life in order to learn to fear Adonai his God and keep all the words of this Torah and all these statutes. Then his heart will not be exalted above his brothers, and he will not turn from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he may prolong his days in his kingship, he and his sons in the midst of Israel. All right, what is the takeaway of all this? Where are we going at with all this? When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself a copy of this Torah on a scroll. He is to write a copy of the Torah. In the same way that the tablets were inscribed by the hand of God, this king will inscribe for himself the entirety of the Torah. It will remain with him, and he will read it in it all the days of his life. He's going to have his Torah scroll in his own hand with him, and he's going to read it. He's going to meditate on it every single day in order to learn to fear Adonai his God and to keep all the words of this Torah. Now read Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 in the context of this, of the idea of the king keeping his Torah with him every day, and that he reads from it every day, that it's very close to him. And it says this, verse 20, then his heart will not be exalted above his brothers. Here's the exercise, the description, the characteristic of humility in the heart of a king. This discussion of humility, not to be exalted above his brothers, is unusual in the ancient world and unusual in the modern world. Leaders are not humble by nature. Very unusual to find a leader who is truly humble. Just the exercise of writing the Torah is an expression, an act of humility, humbling yourself before the law of God. You as king are going to be able to enact laws and describe laws and force people to do things. But before you do that, you are to write the law of God on the scroll and know that law. So we have here also a reminder of Moses' humility. Moses the man was very humble. Numbers chapter 12. Moses the man was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. Humility, the description of humility that I've come to through this last year, especially going through the Torah this last year, Adonai has really opened up my mind to the measure of humility in some of these characters, especially in Moses, but in all of them demonstrated some humility at one time or another. But this idea of the man Moses and his level of humility was just incredible. A method of living that is transparent. The commandments are the identity of Adonai. The commandments of the Torah are the identity of Adonai. Moses spent his life teaching Torah every single day to the people. And we have, what is he teaching? He's teaching the law of God. He's teaching the commandments of God. Ani Adonai, it says over and over and over, I am the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord your God. When we keep these commandments, we become transparent, and the people see the Ani Adonai behind the commandments. Let me say that again. When we keep the commandments, when we keep the Torah and its commandments, we become transparent, and the people see Ani Adonai in the commandments that we are keeping. They see the character of Adonai. They see, in a spiritual sense, they see his personality. They see who he is through us. But it's not just through us in terms of living random and quiet lives of desperation, as the poet says. It's not just us living random lives. It's rather that we're living the Torah. We live out the Torah, and it is that transparency first for the laws of God, which reveal his character, but also the transparency in us as being abiding by these laws. Okay. We become transparent, and the people see Ani Adonai. Remember, the description of humility is being in that transparent pivot point, that when the people look at me, they see Adonai, and when Adonai looks at me, he sees the people. And this is what we see, is these laws are in our midst because we keep them and we do them both personally and as a community. But there is a day coming when then the Spirit, the Ruach, will put his law into people's minds and inscribe his law on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. The Ani Adonai, I am the Lord your God, here in the context of these laws being put on their minds and these laws being inscribed on their hearts. And they will be my people, it says, Jeremiah chapter 31. It began with Adonai inscribing on tablets for Moses the law, the Torah, the commandments. And then we have the kings inscribing it themselves on a scroll. Then we have us receiving the published Word of God. We have these books that are published, and this is the Word of God, and this is our book, this is our method. And then the Ruach is going to put the law into our hearts, that it'll be found deep within our hearts and completed there. And then finally we live with him in restoration and salvation for eternity. His law will be his presence. When we're with him, we'll be in the presence of him, which is his law. We will never be alone. And so I will love the law of the Lord, and it will guide me day and night. And this is what I hope that people can see in my life, is not that I keep Torah out of any sort of sense of legalism, not that I keep Shabbat out of any sense of Judaizing. It is that I reveal the character of God when I keep the Torah. I reveal the character of God when I keep Shabbat. Matthew 5:16, which Yeshua said immediately following the statement about abolishing the law. Let's pull that up here, and I'll just read that to you quickly. Immediately before this statement, about abolishing the Torah. Verse 16, let your light shine before men so they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. It says at the beginning of this, in the same way. In other words, you are the light of the world. Verse 14 from Matthew 5, a city on a hill cannot be hidden, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. They put it on a lampstand so it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men so they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And then this is immediately followed by, do not think I came to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And then he says this, amen, 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 and I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or serif shall ever pass away from the Torah until all things come to pass. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever keeps and teaches them, this one shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So, by this, what I want to do is illustrate for you that, first of all, we're the light of the world, that we let our light shine before all mankind, that they may glorify God. Do not think that I came to abolish the Torah, says Yeshua. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And so, in the same way, letting our light shine before men, so that they may see the good works of Adonai, this becomes our witness and testimony to the world around us. But I submit to you that that witness and testimony is in very grand and flexible terms, like love your neighbor as yourself, but is also represented by all the commandments in Torah, and that by living those out, including in a non sort of corrupt way, but including taking care of the poor and the foreign and the alien that resides, that dwells among you. These are all the things that it means to be a community at this sort of intersection in the kingdom of God. This is what it means to let our light shine before men. And I will conclude it there. Thank you so much. Enjoyed this week's Torah portion very much. Hopefully this discussion has been a benefit to you. If you'd like to reach out to me with your comments, please do, and I'll respond to those. Or if you'd like to go into any detail or further or deeper discussion, we can do that as well. Just reach out to me. I pray that Adonai would be with you to keep you and guard you wherever you may go. And may God just keep you safe during these very perilous times. In the meantime, until we speak again, which by the grace of Adonai will be, of course, next week with next week's Parsha. But until we speak again, unless we're able to speak sooner, may Adonai bless you and keep you this week. Thank you, and shalom, shalom.